Chapter 2. Gloria called me the first thing in the morning. She said she was calling a general meeting of the action group, and we were all to meet at headquarters in a half hour. Now, let me tell you about Gloria. She was a little shorter than me, which was pretty tall for a girl, and not bad looking. She would have been plain looking except for her eyes. Her eyes weren't pretty, but they were odd. They looked just a little oriental, which was nice and which suited her. Then, she had a way of looking at you that made you feel self-conscious. At least, it made me feel a little self-conscious. Another thing about Gloria, she had this habit of saying things to make you ask a question. She would walk up to you and say something like, "Well, I guess it had to happen sometime." Then naturally, you would say, "What had to happen sometime?" And then she would tell you what happened. So when she said for me to come down to headquarters, I knew I had to ask where headquarters was. "Oh, I didn't tell you," she said, knowing darn well she hadn't told me. "I called Reverend Glover last night, and he said we could use that room near the gym for our headquarters." Well, that was pretty good because the gym was in a building owned by the church, and it was always warm in the winter and cool in the summer. The room had a desk in it and a telephone, but I didn't remember the telephone ever working. I told Gloria okay, that I would meet her there in a half hour. I thought my father had left for work already. He works for the Department of Social Services, but he hadn't. "Good morning, sir," he said. "Good morning," I answered. "Would you care for the morning paper, sir?" he asked in this real sarcastic voice. "No." He finished his breakfast without saying anything else. Mom had made some eggs for me and I ate them. Mom didn't say anything either, so I knew they must have had a fight or something. Usually Mom takes my side if he gets on my case too much. When my father finished his breakfast, he got his coat and then gave my mother this make-believe kiss, as if his lips were going to break or something, and then left for work. I knew I was going to be late for Gloria's meeting, but I stayed around and helped Mom do the dishes before I left. I got all the way downstairs before I remembered that I hadn't made my bed. I went back upstairs and she was making it, and I helped her finish. She said I was going to be the death of her. She was okay. "This meeting is called to find out what we're going to do about Chris," Gloria said. "Because we all know he didn't steal any stereo equipment, and we all know that Willie Bobo is a thief and an ex-con, so he probably did it all on his own." "Then how come they got Chris?" Bubba said. "He was eating from a bag of potato chips." Bubba was always eating, and he was so fat that he kept busting the seams of his pant legs. If he didn't do nothing, they wouldn't arrest him. "My mother said they thought it was an inside job," Omar said. "Somebody let the crooks in. The window was busted out in the back, but it was busted out from the inside, so they figured maybe somebody had a key or something, and they then busted the window to make it look like an accident. And the only guy who had a key beside Mr. Reynolds was Chris." "How about that other guy that works there?" Gloria asked. "He don't have a key because he drinks too much," Bubba said, emptying the crumbs out of his hand. "I think he's guilty," Omar said. "You got to be kidding," I said. "How long have we known Chris? He's not a thief, man." "Why?" Omar asked. "Why?" "Yeah, why? You ever seen him steal anything before?" "I've never seen him hanging out with Willie Bobo before either," Omar said, as if he had won his point or something. "And when they got Willie Bobo with some of the stolen stuff, they asked him who let him in, and he didn't say nothing. Then they asked him if it was Chris, and he said, yeah, it was. Don't tell me he ain't no thief. It's them quiet dudes that be going around ripping people off. You don't suspect nothing, so they can get away with it." "I just never believed he would steal anything," Gloria said. "I just never seen him do anything wrong." "Them the kind that be doing stuff like that," Omar came back. "He went into the store with Willie, or he was in there already?" Dean asked. He was in there already, Omar said. Then Willie got a car and drove it near the side door. When nobody was looking, Chris opened the door and Willie come in and started taking stuff out to the car. You know, that's really weird, Gloria said. I've known Chris ever since I was about 5 years old. If you would have told me that he would steal something, I just wouldn't believe it. I mean, he's really a nice guy. Let me ask you something, Omar said. You ever miss anything when you were around him? In school, I lose things, but yeah, you lose things all right, Omar said. To him. Who told you about this, Gianni asked. Who told me about what, Omar said. About how it happened and everything. That's the way it had to happen, Omar said. It turned out that nobody had told Omar anything, and he had made up the whole thing because that was the way he figured it must have happened. We were all pretty mad at him for doing that, in a way, but in another way, we weren't, because it made sense. Omar said that if we didn't believe it happened that way, tell us how it did happen. Of course, nobody could tell how it did happen, and nobody could come up with a better story than Omar. We thought Gianni had something when she said maybe the other guy who worked there, a guy called Brownie, had stolen a set of keys and opened the door for Willie. But Omar had an answer for that too. Now, you figure the police couldn't think of that, right? He said. They thought about it and figured out it wasn't true. They wouldn't arrest Chris for nothing. They gotta have a good reason to arrest the kid. All the pieces didn't fit together to make it sure or anything, but it certainly seemed that Chris was guilty. Anyway, we all said we would give him the benefit of the doubt, and Dean said he was innocent until he was proved guilty, and that was the attitude we ought to take. Then we all said we would be his friends still if he got out on bail or anything. Omar went out to the Coke machine and got 2 Cokes himself. And then he said that he would be his friend, but he wouldn't hang around him too much in case Willie was going to try to bump him off and get rid of him as a witness. You can hang around him if you want, Omar said, but I don't want to end up in the newspaper as no innocent bystander. That just about let the wind out of Gloria's sails about what we were going to do about Chris. She tried switching back to what we were going to do about picketing Mr. Harley, but the talk kept drifting back to Chris and the robbery. We probably would have sat around and talked about it all day, but Dean got us out of it by accusing Omar of really enjoying the fact that Chris was in trouble, and that really seemed what he was doing too. He said he wasn't, but we still got on him, and it made things easier for all of us. Chris was a friend, and as far as we knew, a pretty nice guy. His father and mother were divorced, and he worked part-time to help out. He wasn't the brightest guy in the world, the coolest, just the middle-of-the-road kind of guy who was pretty nice. He had been working since we knew him. In the winter, he worked after school, and in the summer, he worked full-time, as he had been this summer in Listening Land, a place where they sold record players, radios, and cameras and posters and things like that. We were all hoping, and I'm not really sure about Omar, but the rest of us were hoping that Chris wasn't really guilty, but it was hard to believe. Omar had said that the police don't arrest you for nothing. This wasn't enough by itself, but the fact that they had arrested Willie Bobo first and then Chris seemed pretty hard. The next day was Friday, and we heard that Chris was getting out on bail. His father and mother brought him home in a cab and took him upstairs. We hung around to see if he was going to come down, but just his father came down and left. My father had asked me about what had happened when I got home, and I expected to hear one of his lectures about how kids don't appreciate anything they were getting these days and how hard he had had it when he was a boy. If I've heard this story once, I've heard it a dozen times. I could even tell how he was going to twist it depending on how he started out. And it was all going to lead to how he went to night school, worked hard at his studies, and got a job as a clerk for the Department of Social Services. But he fooled me this time. He didn't say anything. At first I thought it was because he had had a fight with Mom the day before, but he just looked sad. I hadn't told him much, just the things I knew for sure. When I saw he looked sad, I wanted to say something else, and so I said I didn't think Chris was guilty, and he looked at me and said he hoped not. And when he said it, he was twisting his ring around his finger, the way he did sometimes when he was upset about something, and I felt that he meant it with all his heart. Now, that got me a little ticked off. It really did. I just sat there and thought about my father feeling bad for Chris and all. The television was on and we were watching the news, something about the price of oil going up. But all the time I was thinking about Chris and the way my father seemed to be affected. "How come?" I said, getting my nerve up. "You yell at me for just having a paper bag on the floor, and you get all upset about the fact that Chris might get in trouble?" He looked at me and shrugged and then looked away toward the television. The news was just about over when he spoke again. "Chris has a hard life at home," he said. "I just hope he doesn't react to it in the wrong way." I didn't even know that he knew anything about Chris. I remembered a year or so before he had gone to Chris's house to see if Chris could go on a neighborhood trip. My father was driving one of the buses and Chris was going to be one of the guys he was going to pick up. He wanted Chris to be monitor of the bus he drove, and I was going to be the monitor in the other bus. He had asked me a lot of questions about Chris that night and had seemed really interested when I told him that Chris's parents were divorced. Saturday and Sunday went by pretty easily. Chris came down and we talked to him about everything in the world except the robbery. I caught myself trying to figure out if he looked guilty. Sometimes I know things, like people don't look guilty or not guilty, but still I look at them. Like you look at some guy's picture in the paper that they caught embezzling money and you say to yourself, "Yep, he's just that type." Gloria said we were going to picket Mr. Harley Monday, but then we found out that Chris was going to some kind of hearing, so we waited around for that instead. When he came back, we really felt great. For some reason, we had thought we would probably never see him again. Then he told us that they just had some kind of preliminary hearing and that they were going to have a full hearing in 2 weeks and then set a trial date. He said he was going to have to get a lawyer. The next day, we were in the church office painting signs. Things like unfair and who needs slums and slumlords. We had 6 signs in all. We had started out with 9 and we had really cool things to put on them, like roaches and rats and filth really hurt. Harley takes the money and leaves us the dirt, which was made up by me. But we only got 3 lines on the poster before we ran out of room. The same thing happened to Mr. Harley, unfair to disadvantaged minorities. The last sign that we messed up was because Bubba spelled tenant with 2 N's. We didn't want to look ignorant, just mad. Anyway, we were in the church office painting the signs when Pat came by and said the mailman had just left a special delivery letter in my mailbox. Naturally, Gloria wanted us to take a break so we could all go over and see what it was. I told Gloria to mind her BI business, but then she said it could be from Mr. Harley telling us what improvements he was going to make. I said yeah, but in the back of my mind I also knew it could be Mr. Harley telling me that he was suing me for threatening him or something. So we all went over to my mailbox, guessing what it might be. "Maybe it's something for your mother," Gianni said. "When's the last time you had a special delivery letter?" "Never," I said, hoping it was for my mother. Bubba said it could be from the school and maybe we all got one. His house was before mine and he stopped and looked in his mailbox. He didn't have a key, so he just looked in the slot, but he didn't see anything. Then we got to my place and I opened the box. It was addressed to me. It was from somebody called Chasen and Diaz, attorneys at law. I felt slightly sick to my stomach. I opened the letter, which was jammed full of papers. They were all legal papers and some of them had drawings on them. I took the papers upstairs and showed them to my mother. She didn't know what they were and she called my father. He couldn't tell over the phone and told my mother to bring them right down to where he worked. Most city buildings look terrible, and the madhouse my father worked in was no exception. The walls were a putrid green color except where the paint had chipped off, and there was a putrid cream color showing through. There was a low wooden railing that separated the people who worked there from the people who came to get welfare. There was only one real office, and that was in the corner. Everything else was just desks. There were 2 desks face to face, a few feet of space between them, and then 2 more desks. This continued along the wall until they reached the office. Altogether, there were 8 desks. My father's job is to check their papers when people are supposed to get emergency checks and to make sure the address and everything is right. When we got down to his office, there was a fat lady sitting at his desk, and he was looking at her papers. She was yelling at him and saying that he was a no good Uncle Tom, and he just ignored her like she wasn't even there and kept looking over her papers. Then he told her something, and she started yelling at him and looking through her pocketbook. Finally, after pulling out about 3 dirty handkerchiefs and a pack of old letters and a rubber band, she found what he needed, and he stamped her papers. Then she smiled and started talking nice to him, but he didn't change his face one time. When she left, he called Mom and me over and took a look at the papers. One lady got mad because she thought that we were welfare people and we were getting in front of her. But then my father told her that we were his family and he would only be a minute, so she calmed down. My father said he didn't know what the papers were for either, and he took us into another office where there was a lawyer and showed the papers to him. He was a young guy, but he had a beard, which he kept pulling the whole time he looked at the papers. Then he looked up at where we were all standing around waiting for him to finish looking at the papers. "Who's Paul Williams?" the lawyer asked. "That's my son," my father said, putting his arms around me. "Well, apparently he has just purchased a building at 356 West 122nd Street for $1. My father looked at me and I looked at him, and then I told him what had happened with Mr. Harley and about me giving him the dollar and everything. Then my father asked the lawyer if it was all legal. "If you sign the papers, they're all legal," the lawyer said. "It sounds like your son went down and complained to the owner about the condition of the building, and the owner is saying, if you don't like the way I do it yourself." "But a whole building?" "It's common for landlords to abandon buildings," the lawyer said. "What he's doing is abandoning this building by giving title to your son. Frankly, your boy doesn't have a thing to lose by accepting it." Now, that's how I got to be a landlord. That's right, a real, honest-to-goodness landlord. The lawyer had a friend of his look over the papers just to make sure, and everything was okay. The second lawyer that looked over the papers worked for the Legal Aid Society, and he said he would be my attorney free of charge if I decided to accept. My father said it was okay, and I was in business. That is, me and the Action Group. I decided that we would all be landlords because that's how we got into it in the first place. The legal aid lawyer, Charlie Turner, drew up a lease form for us to have the tenant sign saying that they accepted the terms we set forth, and we sent them out. Everybody signed them and sent them back to us. And I called the meeting of the Action Group to decide how we were going to fix up our building.